Hello, I'm Cheryl Higashida, Associate Professor of English at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Over the past few months, I've been learning from and supporting CU students, undergraduate and graduate, and staff who are at the forefront of fighting to make CU Boulder survivable for and supportive of BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. In this webinar, these students and staff will discuss their wide-ranging initiatives, groups, and projects. They span many issues: campus diversity, labor rights, support for LGBTQ students, and campus COVID safety. But all of this organizing and activism intersects with and even centers on defunding campus police to truly diversify CU. In the next 40 plus minutes, you'll learn about how the national and global crises of systemic police violence manifest at CU, how CU BIPOC students and staff, many of them women, have been demanding and making meaningful institutional change, and why we need to divest from CU police to diversify CU. How we hear a lot that supporting BIPOC students, diversifying CU Boulder can happen, and that doesn't have to involve divesting from the campus police, that we can and in fact need a strong campus police force for the sake of the safety of all students, as many people are arguing, as many people believe, so that it goes against your demands to cut ties, for campus police to cut ties with Boulder police and to defund the campus police.
Yeah. Right off the bat, I think constantly revisiting this conversation, I think the main thing that always comes up is in regards to how BIPOC students, staff, faculty are already in the current state that we're in, are already not supported, and safety is not a thing on campus right now. And so, in regards to looking at how policing is held up on campus, and how our mental health supports and our other supports in regards to scholarships, like how food, like how students have access to food or housing, like other resources that are really important to, that would qualify as safety and a lot like quality living, is also not supported. And so looking at how policing, how our investment in policing, when we look at the budgets and how much goes in, is invested in policing, but then we also look at how much is not invested in other resources that I just mentioned. When we look at those, we can kind of like start a conversation of what is deemed as safety on this campus in regards to administration and all of that.
And to add on, I think, so exactly what Livia said, right? We are not currently supported by CUPD as Black and Brown students, and we never have been historically when you look at what policing was created to do. And I think as students in underrepresented identities, like all the intersectional ties, as students in CU Boulder, we have seen programs that were supposed to be invested, we're supposed to invest in underrepresented students, be defunded or completely removed. Things like, oh my goodness, it was before my time, but the Women Resource Center and the Gender and Sexuality Center, that were so many programs got, and I think, was it the Ethnic Study Center?
The Ethnic Living and Learning Community.
Thank you. That no longer exists. All those got defunded, and they literally said, oh, we don't have these programs because we don't have the funds to support them. And then they got merged into what is now the Center for Inclusion and Social Change. And I think it's a slap in the face when we see a $7 million budget for CUPD that when we have heard stories of students of color being targeted and harassed by police officers, and when we feel threatened when police officers are heavily weaponized and coming into our classrooms for whatever reason, that's not what safety is. That's not what wellness is for BIPOC students.
Right away. So in my freshman year, I was a part of, when I came to CU, I was a part of the ethnic living and learning community that had been a part of CU for, I think, about like 15 years or so. And at the end of my freshman year, it was announced that it was going to be disbanded, if that's the word we want to use, from campus. And then I think it was a business rep and a global engineering rep or something that was going to be supported more heavily and invested in more heavily on campus. And when the ELLC rep was disbanded, they said that it was for budgeting reasons. And I remember alum and current professors and past professors were all advocating for it to actually stay on campus. And I remember that being like my first experience in regards to CU, and how programs and spaces on campus for BIPOC students are so easily let gone of. Because that year I loved that program. I loved the professors that were a part of it, and the conversations that we were engaged in class, and then just how the professors supported, advised students, and provided resources for students, which was a lot of labor on their parts as well. But I remember at the end of that year, just seeing how like it was gone. And then I was trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do for the rest of my college experience for my undergrad? Because I was kind of navigating, I was undeclared, but I was navigating after that program. I really liked what we discussed, and I was like, okay, how can I get more of this now that this program is gone? Which is why I declared ethnic studies and women and gender studies for my majors. But then sophomore year came, and I was a part of the Women's Resource Center as like a front desk assistant. And I loved that environment, just being able to be in a community. Because like freshman year was such a hard transitioning to college. It was really hard being at CU. Like I grew up in Aurora, Centennial, Eagle Crest High School. And so the population that I grew up with was way more diverse than what CU has. And so it was like a cultural shock coming to CU. And throughout college, I would come home every weekend practically to hang out with my fam, hang out with my community here. And sophomore year is when the Women's Resource Center, or junior year, was when it was announced that was also getting disbanded, along with the Gender and Sexuality Center, the Q, and I think there was one more, but those were all being conglomerated into the Center for Inclusion and Social Change. But yeah, like our main thing is really in regards to tapping into educator power and the role that they play, because they have the capacity to have such a transformative relationship with students, being that they're in contact with students for a majority of the day. And then also just understanding, bringing in that aspect of how the school to prison pipeline nexus functions, and how majority BIPOC students with disabilities, LGBTQ students, are also criminalized and placed into contact with law enforcement, or placed into juvenile detention, which then goes into like the larger criminal legal system. And so kind of bringing those two worlds together and figuring out how can we really tap in to youth agency and educator power and create something that actually creates that space to create like that thriving space.
So I guess I'll start with a little experience. I spent my sophomore year last year as an RA on campus. So I'm trained to call CUPD for various incidents. And I'm a mandated reporter. So that means I report to OIC and OVA if I witness something, hear of something that falls under a bunch of their, what they handle. And so I think as a Black woman, I remember being in a position where I was forced to call the police on another Black person for a mental health crisis. And at the same time, a Black woman a Tatiana Jefferson was killed by the police when it was supposed to be a wellness check. And so I was put in a position where legally I had to call the police, but just that same week, Tatiana Jefferson was murdered. And so I think we should not have to solely rely on the police to do these things when it is also the police that are harming our communities and lynching us. And I guess I want to re-emphasize on what divestment and reinvestment can look like. So many people feel attacked by our demands, but it can look as simple as, for example, using the funds that CUPD currently hold to create then a mental health crisis team. So then as an RA, instead of calling the police that have all the guns on them, I call the mental health crisis team to intervene in various situations like suicide prevention and panic attacks, and that are literally trained for that sole purpose. And with that, I would also like to re-hone in on what I wanted to focus on, Africana study space, because my experience, I would like to hold, using my experience, I like to hold space with other Black and Brown students in a space that will be historically meant to hold us and to remember us on this campus, because we don't have anything right now, in a space where we can go and build community, but then we can also go and do research and go handle our academics, and then we can all come together and do and be and just breathe and be free in a specific building. I don't think it's much to ask for, given that all the other buildings are named after white folks on this campus that we don't really know, right? So yeah.
Hello, my name is Gwendolyn Ropke. I'm a fifth-year distributed studies undergrad at CU Boulder. My studies are between astrophysics, philosophy, and neuroscience, with an emphasis on existentialism. And I am one of the leaders and founders of both BIPOC Women X and Femme Collective, Radical, and Black, which is building leadership amongst communities of color.
Great. And so we're going to be focusing primarily on one of the many projects that you've been working on, Gwendolyn, the divestment from CU police, from campus police to invest in CU BIPOC. And I was wondering if we could just start by having you talk about the main demands.
So the main demands fall into three categories. The first being increased access to mental health responses. So that means both within police force, so having things like cahoots in place so that it's not cops responding to mental health crises, as well as just having mental health more widely available to BIPOC community members. The second is going to be increased anti-racism training, and anti-racism training that is put on by BIPOC people, so by BIPOC scholars who have done significant work in this field and are able to really and truly speak to what we need, rather than it being white folks speaking for BIPOC and what as to what BIPOC need. And the third main point that we want, and main action point, is going to be increased funding to BIPOC initiatives, spaces, and community building projects. So that's looking like having increased funding to BIPOC scholarships, building up new spaces to serve BIPOC students and community members, and just having an increase of resources to, you know, the most marginalized folks on campus, which tend to be Black, Indigenous, people of color. So I think how it started, so all of this started probably when, I want to say, Olivia and Ruth released their petition. So between when they released their petition and then Diversify CU now started. So I had seen the petitions, and I've been at the university for a while in different capacities. So like either being with prison abolition groups or working with Black students. And so when I saw the petitions, I was like, okay, how do we do something though? Because there's one, like, I think petitions are really good to get people like involved and stirred up, but how do we make the university care about this? And so I'd been telling people for a while, I noticed a pattern where the University of Colorado-Boulder magically stayed out of the news for a lot of negative things. It's always occurred to me that places like CSU or Colorado College would pop up in news where CU wouldn't. And so it got me thinking, I was like, okay, like there's petitions going on, there's all these things going on, but how do I get to the university in a way that matters? Not only in the daily camera, not only like a way that really cuts them to the quick. And so I thought about it and I was like, well, why don't I talk to a state representative? I had met Leslie Herod very briefly in passing when I was a representative for CU for the COSI program, which is a Colorado like scholarship initiative. And so I met her in passing. It was back when I was doing like prison abolition work on campus. I remember talking to her very briefly and I was like, oh, like we're doing this work on campus. I'd love to keep in contact with you. Very brief meeting. And so, but when I had engaged with her, she seemed really interested in working with me. And I feel like just because of where I was in my life, like I was about to go abroad, there's all these things going on. I just never did anything. And then in thinking about like, why did they ignore us? I was like, well, you know, they can't ignore someone who is in the state legislature and has this kind of authority, has this kind of power. And so I reached out to Leslie Herod and I waited. And in that time, I started kind of ramping up some of my other work with radical BIPOC women and femmes. I ramped up some of my other work with Black. I was like, okay, now's the time because the world is in quarantine and they've been forced to watch Black people die in a way that they just never have before. And so like as that was all going on with radical BIPOC women femme, going on with Black, I hear back from Leslie Herod's office. It's like, oh, we really want to talk to you. We see that you want to engage with CU critically. Let's set up a call. And so on that call, I was talking to Rep. Herod and I was like, you know, I just think we need to call attention to inequity at CU and racial justice at CU in a real way. And she's like, okay, that's really broad, which admittedly it is. How can I, with my specific platform, help? And I was like, you know what? Like, I don't want to do this work alone. Of course, I don't do this work alone. So let me touch base, gather up these people, rally these people, and then we'll meet with you again. And she's like, well, make sure you bring like this person or this person, like make sure you have certain folks from different spaces rather than just, you know, Red BIPOC and Femme. I was like, you know what, I can do that.
My name is Alejandra, as you just said it.
Abad.
Abad. And I am a graduate student. This is my third year. And I am in the art and art history department. And my program is interdisciplinary media art practices. And basically the kind of artist that I am is multidisciplinary because I work with installation, sculpture, different mediums, but mostly also with community. So
yeah, can you talk about the work of the installation on the missing BIPOC of CU and
thank you. So I had met Wendelin through the Lupita Montoya strike. We were the ones that created the posters for Lupita and we met there.
Around Professor Montoya's denial of tenure and the strike to protest that.
Exactly. And then I got invited to think about how we could make Wendelin's idea come true. Apparently they had this idea of creating silhouettes at some point with a different group, but that didn't happen because nobody had like an idea how to do that. So I proposed that I had access to a laser cutter and I had access to like thinking about the space. So we went to the space and the Norland Library outside has like all these chairs, all this sitting. So I said, hey, let's have the silhouettes sit. We had a meeting, and in that meeting we discussed about the retention rates, the graduation gaps between like 6 years, and we realized that we have a lot of missing students on campus, which is visible anyhow, but it's kind of different to see it in numbers also. And then we also had the BIPOC anonymous stories that we used to kind of contrast like this number to like these stories, because these students don't have like mental health care, they don't have programming, there's no mandatory anti-racist training. So of course they're gonna leave. Of course they're not gonna stay. And it's been like that kind of battle where if we have money, why wouldn't we spend it on the BIPOC students and the programming for them?
Yes, my name is Leanna Looney, and I am a doctoral candidate with the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado-Boulder. So I'm part of a group called Radical BIPOC Women X and Femmes. We are a group that exists independent or separate from the university, but we are a group of undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty, and staff from CU Boulder who very much care about equality and equity on our campus. So we this summer drafted an anti-racist creed in response to what we like to call the Colorado Creed on campus. The Colorado Creed is 3 points, and it talks about tolerating difference, pretty much treating your peers, your colleagues with respect. However, the Colorado Creed is not specific enough when it comes to racism on campus. It's interesting that many of us in Rad BIPOC Femmes have had to actually refer to the Colorado Creed in incidents of being reported for racism. I'll let someone else talk about their experience there. But one of our members was told to go and revisit the Colorado Creed after she was reported for being racist toward a white man professor who was culturally appropriating indigenous practices and items. And so we came up with the CU Anti-Racist Creed in response to the Colorado Creed, and to sort of poke fun at this idea that tolerating difference is not the way to function on campus. So there's 3 main points to this anti-racist creed, the first of which is be accountable for intentional and unintentional racist comments and behaviors I make and or witness. The second point is to take full responsibility to learn why my comments and or behaviors are racist and to be willing to repair the damage or impact that it caused, all while educating myself and growing to dismantle my prejudice and racist behaviors and thinking. And the third point is I agree to acknowledge that phrases such as tolerating difference and recognizing differences perpetuate racial inequities where BIPOC experiences are socially constructed as differences, number one. And these phrases like tolerating difference or recognizing difference deny historic and intentionally systemic forms of racism that BIPOC folks are subjected to under white supremacy. So those are the 3 points of the anti-racism creed. And yeah, people are adopting it and implementing it on campus. I will say that as a teaching assistant this semester, I have shared this with my students in recitation, and it's been quite well received. It's also been a talking point for us to really delve into what it means to, number one, educate ourselves on our own biases and prejudices. But number two, this is an agreement that white students can take up and adopt if they really are serious about this whole anti-racism thing.
What would you say about some of the responses that you've been getting about departments who have developed their own statements on anti-racism, and that in a way it can there's no need to then as a department adopt the CU anti-racism creed because they've been doing their own work. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are, if you know anything about anti-racism and if you know anything about activism in the name of BIPOC folks, you would listen to those people. There are undergraduate students who are going through things on this campus that we'll never know. We will never know. There are staff on this campus, right? And I'm not just talking about administrative staff. I'm also talking about janitorial staff, kitchen workers, who are going through things on this campus that we'll never understand. And so while, yes, academia gives us this cozy space sometimes to, you know, fight and to advocate with certain statements on anti-racism, it is more important to listen to folks who are undergraduate people, who are workers on this campus. When they're free, we're all free, right? So keep doing your work, but also let's work in coalition with one another.
Sure. Hi, I'm Holly Olivares. I'm a PhD student in the Environmental Studies program at the Boulder campus, and I'm also a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow.
Thanks, Holly. And I wanted to start by asking you to talk about how you got the ball rolling on the Diversify CU Boulder Now petition that has almost 3,000 signatures.
Sure, absolutely. So after George Floyd was murdered at the end of May, I was quite appalled at the lack of response and actually lack of respect. And I felt very insensitive response to George Floyd's murder and not any acknowledgement to his family. And I brought this up in several Zoom meetings for the programs and departments and institute that I'm associated with, and really just felt like this was a time when I learned for myself, because I was fairly new to Boulder and fairly new to CU Boulder, that more needed to be done. And I'm a doer. And so I decided to do something. So to get the petition going, there was a faculty who's kind of a mentor to myself and several other graduate students who had shared with us some data. And that was that CU Boulder is in last place in the Pac-12 when it comes to diversity. And so for the graduate students that I worked with in my program, we decided that we wanted to write a petition and we wanted to get the word out about that that's a problem and that's something that we need to focus on. And maybe because it was about the Pac-12, we would get the attention of campus leaders and those who care about the Pac-12. And also we had read Ruth and Olivia's demand letter, June 12th demand letter, and we felt that it was very strong, very direct, and very clear in how to start creating change at the Boulder campus. And so we wanted to amplify that. And so we focused on those two things, the data and Ruth and Olivia's demand letter to the chancellor. And we thought we could use our connections around CU to get that petition distributed and get a lot of signatures. We also knew that it was only a petition. And so we knew from the get-go that was only step one. So the day the petition came out, we opened up social media accounts on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. They're very much alive and growing today. Instagram being our largest following, lots and lots of students who are involved and active and want to be part of the conversation of how to diversify CU now. So Ruth and Olivia and I met with the chancellor. We met with several of the vice chancellors. And in that meeting, we kind of had a transactional conversation of who's in charge of what and what's the timeline to address each item on the demand letter. But in that meeting, each of them also asked for a bit of time because it was just about before classes were going to begin. And they said they needed to focus on campus safety for about 10 days. And so in those 10 days, they asked if we would give them the space to focus on campus safety, and then they would be getting back to us about the demand letter items. And unfortunately, for someone in this scenario, or several someones in this scenario, during those 10 days, the Community Council for Inclusion was announced and the Community Safety Task Force were announced to all of the campus. As far as I can understand it, most of the people named to be in these two new groups were not aware that they were being named to be in these two new groups. And that's concerning. We're talking about anti-racism work here, and we're also talking about campus safety. And we're talking about our BIPOC student, staff, and faculty not feeling safe on campus, which leads into not feeling safe in Boulder. And so to announce these in those 10 days when we were kind of on hold while they focused on campus safety was a contradiction. And secondly, how it was announced in naming people that did not know they were being named, the lack of consent given by those who were named is quite concerning. And I think it speaks very much to us protesting against the structure of the system once again, where the campus leaders feel like they're doing the right thing. They feel like that they're going about things the correct way because they're naming a council. But in naming that council, they very much need to pay attention to who are these people and that they are people and that they're people who get to choose and that they're people that are doing active anti-racist work at CU Boulder, and have they been prior to this? And if they haven't been, then they're not a good match to be on these new groups. So Linda Shoemaker and I wrote this statement, and we released it publicly to call out the campus leaders on their process, their lack of accountability, their lack of transparency, and that in this moment, it is crucial that our BIPOC community is contacted, at least to have the conversation as to if they would like to be involved.
All right, my name is Juan Ramirez. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Department of Geography. I'm also a member of the United Campus Workers of Colorado Labor Union, both on the steering committee and on the anti-racism committee. So one reason I spent a lot of time, so a lot of my research involves anti-racism as tied to immigration. I'm a product of Mexican immigrants, and pretty much all my life I was born here in the US, but have always felt that I did not belong here. Growing up, I grew up in a military family, so we moved a lot. So I actually experienced racism in all parts of the country. With that in mind, most of my experiences whenever it involved law enforcement were never really positive. There was oftentimes, whether it's border patrol, policing, police officers, or whatnot, pretty much that was oftentimes, if I was ever stopped by any of them, like my immigration status or my citizenship status, however you want to put it, was always put into question. I felt like there were sometimes I was singled out if I was in a group of only being the only brown person in that group. Within schooling, being policed more even by teachers. So kind of that's helped shape my worldview and my approach towards policing in the current context, is that it's often targeted people in the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community. I have a personal stake in that, so that's why I spend so much time, because that has affected my mental health and physical well-being, or just over holistic well-being. And I care about it a lot because I want to fight for a world where generations after me don't have to experience those hardships. I mean, being human enough, it can be a struggle, and then having that added layer of things where you're being prejudiced for something out of your own control is something that I feel very passionate about and fighting against. So how that ties in with my work with UCW is, of course, within a capitalist society, we have to work to be able to then make money to afford just to live, to be able to have food, to be able to have housing, all those things. So labor is, for me, and I've delved more into labor issues over the last few years whenever I became a worker at University of Washington Hospital, and kind of just seeing how exploitative many employers are with their workers. And with that in mind, I mean, that's just another kind of intersection of how our overarching structure of this country is it's like one piece, and racism is kind of laid over that as well. So I think using labor as a way to, one, be able to kind of collectively gather and have power and take that power back from exploitative bosses and this exploitative system within the country.
My name is Laura Gonzalez. I hold the staff position at CU Boulder, specifically an academic advisor in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I advise in chemistry, biochemistry, and atmospheric and oceanic sciences. My pronouns, should have started with that, are she, her, hers, and I identify as a brown, red woman, and that is very important to have that racial identity with me. One of the reasons that we decided to make this statement is because we have seen how the virus is actually exacerbating and also just showing all of us the deep inequities that we have in our society. So by reopening campus, we're actually going to propagate more of those inequities in our communities. And what we demand is that CU Boulder moves all courses and necessary campus activities online and remote now. We also demand that that refunds for all students who decide to withdraw past the drop deadline due to a campus shutdown from a COVID-19 outbreak past that date. We demand that CU provides more funding to lend or rent or provide laptops and our computers to students, including access to Wi-Fi to students in need. And this is because of the internet divide, which is also racial. We demand hazard pay for all essential employees who must work on campus. So those are some of the demands that we're making, and we're also requesting leadership to follow up with 3 points of actions that need to be addressed and passed on now. We need to acknowledge and move to protect the BIPOC communities that the reopening of CU campus has disproportionately harmed. It's perpetuating racism in our communities by opening campuses, because once our BIPOC community is infected, they're more likely to die because of the chronic diseases that we have due to, historic and structural and institutional racism. And we also have less access to healthcare. And when we say less access to healthcare, sometimes that doesn't look like, oh, we're missing, maybe we do have a hospital around our corner, but it's not just about having that hospital, right? It's about a Black or a brown person going to the doctor and they're getting dismissed by the doctor. We have a lot of stories across the country where we hear from Black and brown folks that they didn't even get their temperature checked, where they got sent back home and they were left to die because of COVID-19. So it's not just about having that structure close to you, but it's also about that racial bias that even like doctors and health professionals have with Black and brown folks. We need to increase access to healthcare and PPE for BIPOC community at CU and throughout Colorado. And we need to divest from campus policing and other non-essential units, such as the maintenance of a live mascot or buffalo, to invest in BIPOC communities and essential campus work during this pandemic.
Would you like to share some thoughts on the next installation that you'll be working on that will go along with the statement, campus in a time of COVID-19, BIPOC community statement?
Yeah, so reopening the school is an attack on the BIPOC. And so we are going to create the particles of the COVID-19, and we're going to surround them around Ralphie, which is the school mascot, which is also really another thing, right? And we're gonna continue to use the BIPOC silhouettes, but then we're gonna start using the stencils to create the particles around them. Yeah, because I think the most vulnerable population is the minority and the one that the school is not giving attention to, and it's a biological attack basically, and we really want to call that out.
For me, I see these two pandemics both the COVID-19 pandemic and the police brutality pandemic, you know, they're hand in hand. They're twin pandemics. They're highly working with each other. And one of the reasons that I see it that way is because, you know, BIPOCs, specifically Black and Brown folks, you know, they're more likely to be infected because they are more exposed due to inequities, and they're also less protected. It's important to understand that history of structural racism, to understand why is it that Black, Brown folks, Indigenous folks, and Latinx are, you know, dying at higher rates of COVID-19. And it's because of the history of this country. I mean, since colonization, right, there was biological genocide. There was biological genocide by spreading smallpox across Indigenous communities, right? Like about 90% of those communities died because of the virus, because they didn't have the immunity to defend themselves because it was new to them. So for a lot of Indigenous folks, this is actually like bringing intergenerational trauma from when colonizers first got here. For Black folks, we look at this from like, we need to understand the history of policing, right? Slave patrols, what they were known as petty rollers back then, they were created to chase after slaves that were escaping their fields. So they were created to do that. Also, the police across, you know, throughout time, they were pretty much here. They were designed to support and restore order against the anxieties of white folks around the possibility of uprisings from, you know, Black people, Indigenous people, Brown people, poor people, immigrants that were wanting equal rights. So like, there is already all these stories across the country, if folks are listening, where, you know, Black folks are getting chased by police and securities because they're wearing a mask, because they're already believed to be, oh, they may be stealing from this store, right? And if they're not wearing a mask, then they get harassed for not wearing a mask. So Black and Brown folks don't have the privilege to not just wear a mask because they feel like they're taking away their rights. They may choose to not wear a mask because they're afraid that they may get shot or they may get harassed by a police or security officer. And it's not just knowing and being aware of that, but also the intergenerational trauma, which has been widely studied and researched, right? It started because of the kids of the survivors of the Holocaust, that they don't necessarily have to have an experience with a police officer, right? There's Black and Brown folks that necessarily maybe never had a personal experience with a police officer, and they may get triggered by seeing so many on campus. They may get triggered by like seeing more police presence, specifically right now that there's going to be less students on campus. What is the need of having more police officers on campus?
Is please support and amplify the demands of everyone that's in this webinar. They have done so much work, tireless work for free, and they are considering the future of CU Boulder. This is such a large institution, and this expands beyond just the Boulder campus to all of the CU campuses. But this is such a large institution that all of these things, they take time. And because we're students, a lot of us won't be here by the time these things are implemented. Some of them will be, but some of them won't be. But these folks that are on this webinar, they're thinking about decades from now. And I think that's extremely admirable, as in addition to their classwork and their studies, their research, and their own personal lives, and their own oppression that they still experience in Boulder by living in Boulder and surrounding cities, that despite all of that, they continue to show up and do this work. And so please help me and help Diversify CU Now in our work. If you are not a BIPOC student, we'll put it that way, then please help us amplify this work. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but Diversify CU Now is comprised of people of all colors. And so no matter what color you are, join Diversify CU Now, or don't join us, just start amplifying. But amplify these demands, share this video, get involved, pay attention to find them where they are, follow them, and find ways that you can amplify them, whether it's in your department, your program, your institute, whatever that looks like for you, whatever position you're in, amplify the demands of those that are doing the work to put forth demands.